well, we'll wait a couple of minutes. It's not 10 o'clock yet anyway, but I'm just going to do the JISC code and get it to you. So Liaz is in the room with me today, but he's sort of around the corner over there. We've got this fancy thing that does that. But is it showing Liaz?
No.
No, it's the other way.
Where?
Can everybody see the camera? There he is.
Dear.
It's a lesson in camera perspective.
Yeah,
Big, close, small, far away.
we teach the cinematography in this module now. So. Oh.
Excellent. Excellent. Do it. Do it, Jude. Just give it a couple of seconds. I'm just getting the code. I need to create all the sessions manually now in JISC, which is beyond annoying. As we upgraded some systems to make them work less efficiently than they did before, which is the nature of how businesses work, I think. Okay, I have just put the code in the chat. Oops. So if you could enter that, please. If anyone has a problem with the code being entered, then let me know. Audio isn't working for you, is he? That's not the case for anyone else, is it? Everyone else is okay with audio? Okay, good.
Oh, sure.
As if you go into audio settings, Teams is weird. So the little ellipses, 3 dots up the top right, depending on if you're on desktop or web, and then audio settings, and then you can go in there and mess about with some things in there.
Yeah, that's what I wondered.
The meeting link on MLS doesn't take you to this call. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Holly. I will. Cool. Thanks, Izzy. Okay. Yes, I'm going to pin that, and I'm going to deal with that. It's the same. I think it's the same meeting every week, so I'll just put it on MLS. That's what I'll do. Okay. Right, everyone's got the slides, yeah? Everyone can see the slides? Yep, okay, great. Thank you. Right. And away we go. Okay. Right, this week we're going to talk about analysing games. I'm going to do most of this, and then I'm going to sort of shimmy off to the side, and Liz is going to come in and do a little bit as well. It's mostly going to be me this week. We are changing things around a little bit, so Liz is doing the lecture next week, and Mona will be doing the practicals with Liz next week, where you guys will be playing Right to Rome. So it makes sense that we put the correct lecture with the practical. They don't always work. The lectures and practicals don't always work that well together, but in this case, it's they're really closely tied. So we're as well doing that. Okay, right. So there'll be a lot of starting or jumping off points in this lecture. Game analysis is a huge, broad topic. So rather than us saying this is how you do it, we are saying there's this and there's this and this. A lot of this you may not have been aware of before. Pick what's relevant, read, explore, analyze. A lot of these are the kinds of things that I found out during my design career. And once I did, I became a lot better, a far better designer for it, I think. So to understand how something works, and we're talking about understanding how something works and applying it to your own practice, ultimately making better games. So one of the games on the reading list, that's the two important games on the reading, two important books on the reading list, being The Aesthetic of Play and Introduction to Game Analysis by Clara Fernandez Vara. Here's a quote from Fernandez Vara here. What's at stake here is fostering a structured, systematic and methodical way to discuss games, similar to the ones that already exist for literature, film, theatre, non-fiction, documentaries, and philosophy, for example. And we sort of need this in games, really. I would like to ask you, have you analysed the game before properly? And think about that. Have you really done that? 2 seconds, sorry. If you ask the average gamer to talk about game analysis, we hear them talk about things like graphics, gameplay, story, characters, difficulty. You'll see this if you test a game. If you test a game and you don't test it well, and you ask people what did you like about this? These are the kind of things they'll tell you. What did you not like about this? These are the kind of things you'll tell you. But these are a function of fan vocabulary. That's not a criticism, but we need to do further than that as professional designers. So we need to talk about things not like that, but about loops, about pacing and session length or session design, and what the restrictions of the game are, what its motivations are, and the interaction with the game and making sense of that. I've said before, but if you ask someone, if you ask the average person what their favorite film is and why it's their favorite film, they'll say because the acting's really good, the story's really good, the cinematography is really good. And that's what you'll get back. And it sort of doesn't matter what the thing is, the vocabulary isn't there. And we need to, as designers, develop that vocabulary and make it more sophisticated. When you analyze, you should be looking at the following kind of things. So an overview of the game's main defining elements so that we know what you're analyzing and why. So this is relevant for your submission or your work towards your submission. This sets the scene for context, which helps us understand the game historically, culturally, socially, and economically. Video games are the product of their time, so learning about the social, cultural, industrial environment in which they were produced is crucial to understanding them. The analysis proper, which shouldn't be a description of technical specifications or a breakdown of specific design features that may be typical of some game reviews. An analysis of the formal aspects must inquire how they work, hypothesize why they are there, and most importantly, how they relate to each other to support the player experience. The summary of findings should be an overview of what you found out that's relevant to the PX goal you aim to achieve and how these findings will inform your own project, so what you've learned from them. So that's kind of what we're looking for. What should the overview contain? Well, the title, the developer, the year it was launched, as well as the platforms it's available on. All of that's important to what the thing is. It's not trivial information. You should also explain why you've chosen this game and what makes it worthy of analysis. What the number of players is, the target audience, the rules and objectives, as well as a short gameplay and story overview. After overview, you move on to look at the game's context. So this is some of Mona's work from last year that we are continuing with. I'm going to read. Mona's sort of the expert in this stuff, really, but we're au fait with it. So I'll read through this. So context inside context, this is where normally you would look at what Jeanette calls paratexts, all of the text that surround the text. In the case of games, you can get this information from publications, reviews, ratings, dev blogs and talks, interviews, game media, forums, and so on. So let's look at some of these in detail. In order to be able to do an in-depth analysis, you should first determine the focus of the analysis. Will you analyze a level, a difficulty level, a mini game, a puzzle, a quest, a core gameplay loop, a boss battle, etc.? You should also state the rationale here. Why have you chosen this particular section for analysis? How is it relevant to your project? Seeing as in this section we discuss the context of your analysis, you should also relate the object of your analysis to the game overall. Where and when this section takes place, how it can be accessed, what happens in this section, and what do the players do here. The production team, second note, helps you contextualize the game by offering you additional information about the game you analyze. The size of a production team and budget will ultimately impact how the game looks, how it feels, the level of polish, but also knowing more about the developers and studio and what they've previously worked on can give you information about how they continue or break with their own style, for example. So here you can uncover more about the production process and how this impacted on the player experience. The genre is important, as any will either conform or break genre conventions and thus bring innovation, whether good or bad. But in order to understand whether a game is doing any of this, or how you need understand whether a game is doing any of this, or how, you need to first understand what the conventions of a particular genre are. And this goes for your practice as well. You need to know the conventions and their role in order to break them. We've discussed game genres and criteria classification, or you've discussed game genres and criteria for classification at length in first year. So you should revisit that content if you're unsure. Platform is important as it impacts on control schemes and overall UX. We'll talk at large about platforms in a future lecture, but for now it's important to note that your context section should always clarify what platform you're playing the game on. Just like genres, platforms come with affordance, constraints, and conventions. So learning to identify these early and thinking about how they affect the PX is an important part of analysis. The socio-historic context is usually what many people think about when they hear context. This is important because it impacts on player experience at the level of reception. Think about Wordle and when Wordle became a phenomenon, but also at design level, like any media games are a product of their time, which impacts on their visual and gameplay style. Multiplayer games resurgence in popularity during COVID, for example. Narrative, think about culturally appropriate content here. How a game is distributed, marketed, and monetized is part of its economic context and affects how it reaches its audience. We'll discuss this at depth in a later lecture, but for now it's worth noting that some things to consider here might include the game's purpose. Is it a commercial game, for example? What business model does it have? How is it distributed? What revenue did it generate? And of course, you can't have revenue without audience. It's interesting here from a PX perspective to look at a target audience in comparison to actual audience if you can find this information. Ratings and advertising give you some info about the target audience sometimes, so does the genre and visual style, play modes, difficulty settings, etc. And finally, relations to other media. Games constantly reference other media, so it's important to think about why this is and what do the developers aim to achieve in terms of PX when doing so and appealing to players' prior knowledge. We'll talk about adaptation and transmedia storytelling in a later lecture, but for now, if you're analysing a game that references another work, always try to engage with this original source in order to understand how the PX in the game sits in relation to the audience and experience of the latter. And that's really relevant to our playing of original Werewolf and then an adapted version of Werewolf last week, where we thought about what the differences are and what they were trying to achieve, assuming that the audience was different. Okay, analysis structure. Two approaches to analysis: formalist, which focuses on the formal building blocks, the words of a game, and the structuralist approach, which focuses on the game as a system, the relationship between the words, the grammar or sentence of a game. According to Ian Bogost, we may either focus on how games work or what they do, how they inform, change, or otherwise participate in human activity. In this module, through analysis and critical practice, we can hopefully do both. Think of these as interrelated and interdependent blocks. We all know that the sum is greater than the parts. So in order to understand how PX is achieved, we would have to consider them all, and most importantly, the relationship between these. Games are, after all, a combination of technology, interaction, aesthetics, and story. So how these work or fail to work together will impact on whether they achieve the desired PX or not. I would suggest that you start the analysis by first identifying the formal, the dramatic and dynamic components, and then starting to see what the relationship is between them, how they work together towards achieving the PX goals. Let's dive into each of those in a bit more detail. The formal components of a game are players, objectives, rules and procedures, resources, conflict, boundaries, and outcomes. We don't have time to recap these in full depth today, but we've discussed these in first year. You've discussed these in first year. They'll be familiar to you by now. If you need a refresher, I would suggest you have a quick read through Tracy Fullerton's Game Design Workshop, chapters 3 to 5. Some elements to consider when talking about players. How do players begin playing? Where do they encounter the game? How does the game start? How does it teach the players what to do? What number of players is it designed for? And what are the interaction patterns supported by the game? Single player versus game, player versus player, multiple players versus game, multilateral and unilateral competition, cooperative play and team competition. Objectives keep the player motivated and give them something to work towards. The objectives need to be achievable, even if challenging. Many video games have more than one objective. Some have different objectives for different players, and some use emergent or player-defined objectives that the players set for themselves as they play. As you start working on your analysis, try to identify what these objectives are, what are the means to achieve them, and how are the objectives communicated to the player? How do different objectives impact on the PX? The rules describe what is allowed and what isn't allowed in the game, and they need to be clearly communicated to the players. When analysing a game, try to identify the rules and the impact these have on PX. Think back to our Werewolf discussion last week. It's easier to identify rules in tabletop games than in video games, as the rules are written down, visible to all players and not hidden in code. What were the rules last week? How were they enforced? What effect did they have on moment-to-moment gameplay, but also on overall experience? The procedures are the methods and instructions for playing the game, what the players have to do to achieve the objectives. These are the actions or mechanics allowed by the rules that the player performs by pressing specific buttons. We'll talk about these in depth in a couple of minutes. For now, it's just worth noting that for the purpose of analysis, you might want to group them into the 4 categories listed here: starting action, progression of action, special actions, and revolving actions. The next formal element you'll have to think about are resources. The types of resources that the game uses should be relevant to what the player needs to achieve their objective. Some of the things you should consider here are utility and scarcity, how their availability is balanced against their utility. If resources are scarce and need to be carefully managed, this creates a particular type of play experience, whilst at the same time increasing the value of those items. Balancing scarcity and utility in your game is an important part of the design process, because in many games, finding and managing resources is key to gameplay. You might think of this in terms of what the player has and what the player needs. Similarly, if time is a depleting resource, then this impacts on the pace, which impacts on the PX, creating a frantic and anxious style of gameplay where strategy becomes impossible, but which works well to support social play, for example. In terms of analysis, you might want to address what resources the players need in order to achieve the goal. How are these resources made available? How can they be gained? How much of each is given to the players? How they're depleted and how essential they are for achieving the goals. Only some of these might be relevant to the games that you study and design, so please focus on those. Conflict is a contest between opposing forces. In games, these forces are the player who's trying to accomplish the objective, and the game or other players, which make this difficult by placing obstacles in their path. Some of the most common sources of conflict in games are obstacles, so physical and cognitive challenges, opponents, other players or NPCs, or dilemmas where the player has to make choices which impact on the game and whose consequences can't be foretold. Games are closed systems. They are delimited from the real world, sometimes by a physical border, sometimes by a conceptual one. Some of the things that you could focus on here are the boundaries of the game. How do players know that the game has begun or ended? What are some of the boundaries of the game world? How are the limits of the game communicated to the player? In order for a game to appeal to players, its outcome needs to be clear, but uncertain. By clear, I mean that there's a clear win condition, arrive at a destination, have a certain number of points, defeat all opposing forces, and so on. So the outcome is always related to the objectives. Has the player achieved the objective or not? But the outcome is also defined in relation to the player interaction patterns. Player versus game will probably have a different win condition than a multiplayer game. You might want to focus the analysis here on the possible outcomes, how these impact on the PX, how they're communicated to players, and if they're clearly communicated. Is the game a zero or non-zero sum game? Is there a clear win or lose condition? Does the outcome change depending on the number of players and objectives? I'm going to hand over to Les.
I'll put my camera off over here, and then I'll magically appear in this one over here. Amazing. That was formal components. That was just read by Fraser, and this is going on to dramatic components, which, if you remember, is the next step. So students are often confused about what comes first in the ideation process. Is it the story or is it the gameplay? Well, in line with last week's tutorial, PX goals should come first. It's after this point that the player's journey with the game and gameplay can converge. Think back to our discussion of Brian Upton's situational game design. Remember, I spoke to both groups about it actually in the tutorial. And we found our experience of the adaptive works of One Night Werewolf and Traitors was likely affected after our playthrough of the source material of playing through Werewolf. As players, we found ourselves changing our interpretation of the rules of One Night Werewolf and Traitors, affecting our engagement with these games. A Counter-Strike player might take a radically different approach to Fortnite compared to someone coming from, say, Fall Guys. You know, that's the same sort of idea. These relationships of games between games with ourselves and with our environment is discussed by Jesper Jewell, which is of the quote on the slide there. Games are both real and they're both fictional. They coerce us to join the dots between practical rules, abstract concepts of play, and narratives. We, the readers of this process, get tangled up. This extends beyond our interaction between games, but also our view of our environment, looking outside the games, which we'll actually look at next week. In chapter 4 of the Game Design Workshop, Fullerton identifies 7 dramatic elements. There we have challenge, play, premise, character, story, world building, and the dramatic arc. These elements allow us to understand these relationships through a dramatic lens. A lot of the concepts encapsulated by these elements are covered throughout this entire lecture series or in your prior studies with Darshana and Mona. The challenge component observes games from a PX perspective, balancing difficulty and ability with Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, which we'll cover later. The play component understands that we are free moving beings through fixed rules of play. We interact with rules differently based on who we are and what we've experienced, just as I've discussed. Think of your Bartle player types, for example. Heavily inspired by the analysis of dramatic works, the remaining elements in that pie chart, the ones that aren't highlighted visually there, I've lost my place. Great. Yeah, the remaining elements of the pie chart allow us to go deeper into analysis of the dramatic conflict and the tension of games. The premise component articulates that it's difficult for many players to connect with some games if what they're playing is too abstract. Developers need to establish a premise through setting or metaphor for their target players to become invested in the game. This even applies to games like Tetris or chess, where this is already abstract. Relating to what Fullerton states, pushing around numbers on a spreadsheet isn't enjoyable for most players. You know, there needs to be some kind of like component we can relate to. Characters are central to any story-driven game. Perhaps this is obvious, but character traits and personality provide good entry points for games analysis. How much free will do characters have? Do they empathize with the player and each other? It's also worth considering the player's position as a character within the story, and characters controlled by the players. Even in instances where the character is faceless, so take your Valve games like Shell and Gordon Freeman, or where this is otherwise not specified. The story component asks us to consider a story's presence and the player's ability to affect it. Many games choose to write extensive backstories, which they build up on, similar in concept to premise, which I just spoke about. These games might be more linear, and the player might not have much ability to change it. This forms the meta of the game, the motivations of the player that don't change in minute-to-minute gameplay. Maybe only between levels, acts, between series entries, or sometimes not even at all. Other games focus on branching narratives, where the player has direct influence. These games aim to have stories with greater presence. However, this is often harder to pull off and can sometimes make a game feel more restricted. Dialogue options that don't represent the player and games with unnecessary narrative detail can put players off. For the final two elements, cast your mind back to Darshana's module in second year, I think, for you folks, which covered world building and the dramatic arc. Think about how these influence PX in terms of adhering to or breaking expectations of genre conventions and the connection between gameplay and emotional motivations. The link to GDC talk by Genova Chen on designing that game company's journey is a crucial example of how the dramatic arc and emotional journey they wanted to take the player on informed the entire design process, visually and functionally, and even in the production side of things as well. As Fraser's just spoken about, heavily recommend 3, 4, 5, like chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the Game Design Workshop. It's an easy read, and you can get through it in a week of light reading. If you're interested in this abstraction of fiction, coalescing with real rules, like if that's something that you kind of struggle with, like with the abstract into reality, Jules Half Real is available at the library. It's quite old now, but that doesn't mean you wouldn't get anything useful out of it if you're interested in kind of figuring it out a bit better. There we go, and I'll hand you back over to Fraser again. Go.
Okay, so at the heart of every game is a set of formal elements that, when set in motion, create a dynamic experience in which the players engage. How the interaction of the formal and dramatic elements is structured forms the game's underlying system and determines the nature of the game and the experience of the players. The basic elements of the system are objects, properties, behavior, and relationships, economies included in that. Again, if you need a refresher on those, Chapter 5 in Fullerton's Game Design Workshop before you embark on your analysis. Objects within the system interact with each other according to their properties, behaviors, and relationships, causing changes to the system state. How those changes are manifested depends on the nature of the objects and interactions. I'm going to talk you through these now and talk about models of structural analysis as they're used in industry. So we're going to talk about loops, core loops, game loops, etc. Some very practical analysis methods, ones that are used in industry frequently. There are some differing definitions in industry and around it of the core loop. You'll hear a lot of people call something like call something the core loop, referring to something that might be similar to a critical path or something like that. I'll give you my definitions based on spending a lot of time working professionally on exactly this sort of thing. I spent a long time with loops and getting them right. I think it's really important. And it seems like a trivial thing that you can say, well, this game, you can very quickly say, well, the loop in this game is this, this, and this, but actually getting it right is pretty important. And designers understanding that and communicating that to the player through everything that you're handing to the player, and everybody being on the same page is really important to the success of the thing. Being able to analyze a game at this level and spot problems at this level is, I believe, fairly crucial to scaling your whole game up into a meaningful experience. Anyway, the core loop is the heart of your game. It's kind of the opposite of context. Context is obviously valid, but this is just another lens entirely. The core loop is what you do. In a racing game, it's go fast, don't crash. In GTA, it's drive and shoot people. The game loop is why you do the core loop. It's the first layer of context. This is where context narrative might start to become relevant. A quest, progress, motivation, etc. I think a lot of people erroneously say core loop when they mean game loop. A game loop is the layer beyond the fundamental interaction and transaction of the game. The important thing to remember about it is that the game loop likely amplifies the core loop. It makes you do it, makes it more meaningful and more powerful. So the game loop is, I want to achieve something, so I do an action, so that I earn something, so that I improve something, so that I can do something else better. So notice there's conflict and drama in this. We have words like but, accept, need. I want to do this, but I have this goal, accept, or I need to blah blah blah, but I need something else to do it. There's drama and tension already built into the game in a core loop at a fundamental level. Saying I need to do this so that implies that there is a restriction already there, which I need to work to change. So I could kill that next enemy, but this one is in my way. I need to get past this corner first. Upton talks about these restrictions, whether rules, obstacle, level design, or interface, as being fundamental. Last week I said I thought that, this is my personal opinion, that all games needed tension or drama or conflict or risk, etc. To clarify that, I don't mean that all games need fighting or competition. I mean that in good games, there is often a clear, immediate problem for a player to solve or a restriction to remove or minimize. The meta loop, or meta layer as I call it, completes the layers. It can change the game loop and provide different context for play, but it likely always gives you renewed motivation to activate the core loop. These meta loops might include contexts like events, social, seasons, episodes, metagame events, so reacting to how other people are playing the game. At this point, the way we've been looking at this is getting a little closer to sounding like how scholars speak about cinema, or how writers build a meaningful world or narrative, the hero's journey or Save the Cat or something like that. So if we were to do just that, this is an example that I've used many times. Batman has, I'm being glib here, but this works really. Batman has been working at cleaning up Gotham since 1939 and is still at it. The core loop, you might describe this as the interaction or a page or two in a comic. The reward here is information to better understand the puzzle, piece a location together. This is like, beating up a goon for information or something like that. That's what Batman does, right? He goes and finds people and gets information out of them to try and bring a crime, to try and get someone for a crime, arrest someone for a crime. The game loop, this might be an arc, 10 or 12 issues. So Court of Owls, The Long Halloween, etc. There's an enemy, and this is the story of them being brought down. So the core loop happens to, and the motivation is provided by the game loop. I need to bring this person down, so I need to get information, I need to get locations, I need to get evidence, doing the same thing over and over again to build towards the game loop. And then the meta loop is the big goal. This particular meta layer event stays the same. It's clean up Gotham. It's never going to be achieved. Think about the war on drugs or something like that. In games, this is an evergreen goal. It's almost a wild goose chase. A player might set out to achieve it, knowing, or perhaps not, that achievement will never come. So there are games that have inbuilt, really simple inbuilt evergreen goals, like be the biggest crime lord in America or something like that. And then the game can obviously balance that against you. It can always introduce conflict where you're not, you were the biggest crime lord, now you're not, now you need to be again. Those types of things. So try this with something, try to identify the loops in something. If you're doing this, you're already way beyond I like this game. You're being a more objective designer and a more objective analyst. If you're looking for more references or examples of loops, try the Deconstructor of Fun website. Deconstructor of Fun is it sort of started in free to play. They do lots of breakdowns and loops and broader analyses and sort of frame that as a business intelligence or insights type thing. We had lots of these sent when I worked at free-to-play companies. We had lots of this stuff sent round by the sort of exec suite who were like, well, look at this. This is really interesting. And my take was like, yeah, no shit. This is what we do day in, day out. So I would say if you learn, I would take Deconstructor Fun with a pinch of salt. They're often not right. But this is if you learn anything from this is a really good example of how to present information to your boss or in a DES313 submission. It can be really persuasive to present things in a way that looks formal like this. So I would engage with it on that basis. That's what I've always said to people. It's the place where you take the results with a pinch of salt, but you learn how to present stuff to people. Okay. Let's look at another set of lenses. So maps in and out, flow diagrams and journeys. We can go through each quickly and take a look at why these sorts of analyses are useful for your own practice. A lot of what follows is going to continue talking about free-to-play and games as a service or live games, because these are the kind of games that people play for a long time. That's what they're designed for. There's a deep tradition of provision and optimization in these games that makes getting the experience right essential. Experience maps, which is my name for them, but let's make it stick, are a structural overview of how the player navigates through play, not in a geographical sense, but in terms of motivation, empowerment, or restriction. Similar to loops, it's the sort of ins and outs of flows. We call these sinks and taps, somewhat cynically, in games as a service, sinks being, or taps being something that the developer turns on that gives resources to players, and sinks being the thing that the taps pour into that sucks all the resources away. And sometimes the taps aren't, the flow from the taps is deliberately restricted so that people buy things. Or also so that people engage more, so that they come back more, so that we can change the flow rate from those taps, so that people come back more at specific times. If you do a map like this, it can reveal complexity. This is one that I did for Clash Royale, which is something I was really interested in at the time. So again, analysis is part of a designer's job. I did this to help me understand the flow of player movement around the broader footprint of the game, where the inflows or taps were, and where the outflows or sinks were of various currencies and resources. Importantly, looking at this, I can understand how the system is balanced. By that, I don't mean numerical balance. Let's say the game isn't fun or feels pointless. This view might provide me with an understanding of why. Maybe I have too much of one resource in one place, but too few options on how to use it or spend it. It mightn't just be balancing. Is it clear where I get things? Am I getting the same resource from different places? Why? Is that necessary? Is that helpful to the player's experience? I can address all of that by looking at a game's experience map or making a game's experience map. Layouts are a more geographical way to understand the game, literally how the player moves around the game. This is not just mobile. Think about any game which has any sort of outside of the core game component. So RTS, simulations, any management game, any resource-based game. This gives us a view of how do I move around it and why is it like this? Is it optimal, consistent, etc.? Can it be improved? Here's one I did for the game Golf Clash. It's a really successful mobile game made by Playdemic. This view might help with understanding consistency, a holistic model for the whole game and its complexity, because this is a view we don't ever see as a player. This is really easy to do by just taking screenshots and laying them out in Visio, PowerPoint, XD or similar. So I'm seeing how a player moves around the front end. I'm getting context on why what's on any given screen is there, because I'm looking at where I came from, and why screens should be different. Similar screens should be different in different contexts, these types of things. An example of how this type of thing can be really useful. CSR Racing was a big game that I worked on eventually, but not at the point that this decision was made. But it's really interesting anyway, and something I've spoken about a lot. Initially, CSR Racing, like many other racing games, started on a map screen. So basically, that's functionally a geographic list of races. It's a list of races put on a map. You choose the race that you wanted to do, and then once you'd finished it, you'd go back to the map screen, win or lose. If you needed to upgrade your vehicle or select a different one to win a race, then you go to the upgrade screen or the garage and back to the map to select a new race, right? Fine. So you start here. You start here, if everyone can see that, and then you go to a race and you do a race back to the map, whether you win or lose it. If you get enough currency, okay, I'm going to upgrade, and off you go and upgrade. That's how games worked, and that seemed like a fairly standard thing to do in a racing game. It also meant that we were getting into the game itself with a minimum of clicks, which is always a good thing from a UX perspective. I'll talk about that in a sec. This was upgraded so that the new version of the game, there were some pretty smart people in this team, and they figured that in order for this game to have good retention, for people to hang around for a long time, there needed to be more to the game than just selecting a race and doing it over and over. The game needed to be about the car collection, and that's that evergreen goal again, but also one that would appeal to completists and curators, etc. So like I said, standard UX procedure in game design at the time was that you should get players into a game with as few clicks as possible, but the dev team decided that players landing on the car screen where they open the game would build an attachment to the car and the car collection, an emotional connection that provided motivation to do races. So they added an extra screen in the core loop, added complexity to improve players' emotional attachment to their car collections and therefore the long-term game. So instead of starting on the map, you started in the car. If you want to upgrade your car, you just upgrade it there and then. If you want to go to a race, then you go to the map and select a race, then do the race, and then it brings you back to the car, right? You've earned currency, you're back at your car, I can upgrade that. So I go to upgrade the car with the currency or the parts I just earned. And so this made the game about the car rather than about the racing. Did it work? CSR Racing was made by 6 people I know who spent their redundancy payout from BlackRock, a Disney studio in Brighton which closed. They made a game over a few months in Jason's attic. It came out in 2012 and it made $12 million in its first month. The series is still going and it's been downloaded more than 200 million times. examples of where I've used layouts in my own work. I was lead designer on the follow-up to CSR, which wasn't CSR2, it was something else. And this was some photos I took at the time there. So I would have a thing I called screen requirements, which is on a front end system, what does the player need to know right now? Where have they come from? Where are they going? What's the player's overall game motivation? And how does this area of the game reflect it? So this is just me saying, here's how a player moves through the front end or moves through the game. Here's what they need to know at each stage. And I can see to the left or to the right where the player has come from and where they're going. I would move from there to wireframes. Wireframes is taking that information and laying it out, thinking what's the hierarchy is important here, what's the most important thing, have I seen something like this elsewhere, so do I already know how to use part of this, do I need to be taught to use it, is it well laid out, is there too much stuff on the screen here, do I need to break this out a bit? And then I would rationalize all that stuff there, and then I would move to a sort of more holistic view. So I put all of this up on the wall, and then Henry, who was the UI designer, who's a UI artist, UX designer who sat beside me, he would take all that stuff and make it look awesome. And he was au fait with the sort of current trends and usability and interaction design and graphic design. So he'd make it look cool, much better than I could. But I'm concerned with the function of this thing, right? And I know the holistic layout of the whole game. I know the interactions that people are using elsewhere. I know what their motivation is. I know where they've come from. So that's important. So does this look awesome? Does it feel awesome? Is it consistent? Does it fit with the style of game? Is it satisfying to use? This is where something like being used to thinking about games on an experience map or layout level might be useful to you. Okay, timescales. So in theory, the game loop will stay the same for the most part, but the game board changes over time, doesn't it? Often in games, your city gets bigger, or the map you've unlocked expands, your skill improves, or you're spinning more plates. So it's worth thinking about. Things in these terms. The core loop is a thing that you do second to second or minute to minute. Often, the game loop is something that you're trying to achieve in a session, maybe. Your immediate motivation. Then there's midterm goals and long-term goals. It's worth thinking about these loops and their context in the player journey over time. If we think about core loops as what I've just said that, what the player does every few seconds, and then the game loop, hour to hour or day to day, midterm a bit longer, long-term goals that are layered in on top of that. Similar to the loops I described earlier, which add context to the core loop, player journeys recognize that players' experiences are different on different timescales and that their motivations change depending on the cycle they're currently in or thinking of. So in CSR, that's win a race to improve your car, to win an opponent's car from them, to add to your car collection, and then I start over again. But all the time I'm winning races. But depending on how deep I am in this experience, if I've been in this for a month, it's probably more about the car collection than it is about improving my current car. In Clash Royale, I need to win a battle to get chests, to level up my card collection. And then there's a collection servicing metagame beyond that. In Candy Crush, it's match candies. What I'm doing is trying to get 3 in a row. And that's to win a level, to get past this current level I'm on. Why am I doing that? Well, I probably want to go further than my friends. It's there on their map screen. And beyond that, it's probably maintaining some sort of streak or something like that, engagement-based, retention-based. Any other ideas? Try this out, map out phases of your player journey. This is a useful lens to look at your PX goal through. I would give it a go. So as I said, there's a big difference between what the player experiences when they start the game and what they experience when they've been playing it for a month or 6 months or a year. It's important to think about this too when you're analysing a game, because the games often change significantly over time. We call these stages early game, the mid game, and the elder game. So In Clash Royale, that's you know, at the start of the game, that's orientation, setting off, learning about things, tutorialization, keeping it simple. I'm not spinning a lot of plates, I'm learning. In the mid game, it's about collecting things. It's about making progress that I can see. I'm starting to curate stuff. I'm building, and I'm returning to the game a lot to see the thing that I've curated continuing to be nice and expanding, and I'm collecting. And then in the Elder game, this is about mastery. I'm doing it right. I'm spinning lots of plates, strategically. I'm doing it competently. It's about ownership. It could be about social, showing this stuff off. It could be about mentorship. It could be me helping someone else to get there. So this is another method of analysis. What's happening at different points? When does it change? Does it change for everyone? There's so many ways you can analyze a game and communicate that. There's no hard rules, but there is being thorough and consistent with your own approach, not avoiding difficult truths. This is so much of what we do as designers, is not avoiding difficult truths, facing up to them and sorting them out, even if it's just jettisoning the part of the game that they're in. What I've been getting at here is that looking at games this way, whether free to play, AAA, hyper casual, has helped my understanding and has revealed problems in my own games. So I made a habit of this, and it had an impact on my own designs. I got better at spotting and rationalizing things quicker. This here is just me making progress, again in Clash Royale, and tracking it as I go. So me looking at what chests I get when. I spoke about notebooks in the last session. You'll come across things in your analysis journeys that make you think, that's clever, I can use that. So here's a thing in Clash Royale at the top of the shop where I got one panel for free. So this was something I collect as chests, obviously. I collected one, and then the next one was $4.99 on a deal, and then the next one's 20 quid. And yeah, I'm looking at whether that's a deal, but there's also a thing happening here where there's like a story taking place across that banner, if you like, and it's incomplete. And that makes me want to tap that last thing. And that's something I did a screen grab of and was like, yeah, that's clever. I might use that at some time. Okay. So that's where we are. Take notes, analyze yourself. Not you, I don't mean personally, I mean, you yourself go out and analyze things, look at them. We're going to be going through this process a lot in seminars. It's a good practice to get into. It will make you a better designer, especially if you're realistic about it and if you're thorough and deep and analytical about it. This week, we're going to do, we reckon, read Game Design Workshop, try your own game loops and player journeys and layouts, be thorough and critical. Don't just go through the motions and come out with some bullshit. Think, does this work? Is this really what's going on? Is it right? And then re-examine it, interrogate your own work. That's what makes designs good. Then when we get to seminars and practicals, tomorrow, getting there. There will become second nature soon. You analytically, we're going to analyze Wordle. So play the app or the web game before class. Play some of the alternatives. For week 3, we'll be looking at Mona's Right to Roam in class. For your homework for next week, we'll look at dysphoria. Okay, cool. Any questions? We've actually got time, which is a first. This will probably never happen again. We've got 5 minutes. I will stop sharing and I will stop recording.